The rain had been falling for hours over the little town of Maple Cross, a steady, rhythmic drizzle that seemed to soften the world into watercolor. The cobblestone streets glistened like glass, and the lamps that lined the empty square reflected long golden ribbons onto the ground. Most of the shops had gone dark by now, their owners tucked safely inside their homes, their chimneys breathing faint curls of smoke into the night. But at the very edge of town, where the train tracks curved out toward the fog and the forest beyond, one building still glowed faintly with light, the old Maple Cross station. No trains had stopped there in years. The tracks were rusted now, the signal lamps broken, the timetable signs faded and cracked with age. Yet somehow, the station remained alive in its own quiet way. The wooden benches inside were still polished, the big clock on the far wall still ticked softly, and every evening at 8, a small lantern was lit by the ticket window. No one knew who lit it or why. It was simply always there, burning gently through the night, casting its golden light on the dust motes that swirled lazily in the air. If you stepped inside, you would feel it right away, the stillness that wasn't empty, but full of something tender and patient, the kind of quiet that holds a heartbeat. The floorboards creaked underfoot, as if remembering the hundreds of travelers who had once hurried across them. Lovers parting, soldiers returning home, families waving goodbye. Every sound seemed to linger here a little longer than it should. The echo of a footstep, the whisper of rain against the window, the faint tick of the clock, all of it merged into a slow, rhythmic lullaby. On the far bench sat a woman, wrapped in a long wool coat the color of smoke. Her name was Clara. Her hair, once dark, was now silvering softly, catching the lamplight like threads of frost. She came here often, though never at the same time, and always alone. Sometimes she would bring a thermos of tea. Other times, just a small envelope in her hand. Tonight, she carried one of those envelopes, cream-colored, with edges slightly worn, tied with a ribbon. She ran her thumb along the seal, her breath fogging in the cool air of the station. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the glass panes like quiet applause. She glanced up at the clock above her. Its hands moved slowly, unhurried, steady. The same clock had hung there since before she was born, and somehow, it still worked perfectly. She smiled faintly. The old clock had seen everything: arrivals, departures, promises made and broken, tears shed quietly behind ticket stubs. And now, it kept time for her too. She stood and crossed the room, her footsteps soft on the old wood. The letter in her hand trembled slightly as she knelt before the station's lost and found cabinet, a small, wooden drawer built into the wall beside the ticket booth. The brass plate above it read, "Letters for the Journey." It was a tradition that no one quite remembered the origin of. Decades ago, travelers used to leave letters for those they loved, or those they hoped to meet again someday. Some letters were addressed, others were not. Over time, it became something like a ritual. Even after the train stopped coming, people still left their letters. And though no one officially maintained the station anymore, someone or something always made sure they were found, and the drawer was never quite full. Clara slipped her letter into the slot, pausing for a moment with her hand on the wood. "One more," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Just one more for tonight." When she let go, she felt the faintest hum beneath her fingertips, like the echo of distant wheels turning on rails. It was gone almost immediately, but it made her smile. She walked back to the bench and sat down, wrapping her hands around the thermos she'd brought. The tea inside had long gone cold, but she sipped it anyway. She didn't come for the warmth. She came for the quiet, the kind of quiet that let her hear the world breathe. As she closed her eyes, the sounds around her deepened. The rain became softer, slower. The clock's ticking grew gentler, more like a heartbeat than a sound. She could almost hear the echo of an old train whistle, far away, fading into the fog. And then something shifted. The air changed. It wasn't a sudden thing, not startling, but it was noticeable, like the room itself was taking a deep breath. Clara opened her eyes slowly. The station lights seemed warmer now, and through the fog windows, she thought she saw a faint shimmer. movement along the empty tracks. She leaned forward, heart steady but alert. There, in the distance, the shape of a train began to appear, faint, ghostly silver. Its outline flickered softly in the mist, almost unreal. It made no sound. The rails did not rattle. The air did not move. But there it was, a train arriving at a station that hadn't seen one in decades. Clara didn't move. She didn't need to. The train glided in as if carried by memory itself, its carriages glowing faintly from within. She could see silhouettes in the windows, people sitting quietly, reading, gazing out, smiling faintly as if lost in thought. Some looked young, some old, all peaceful. The train stopped, and a faint breeze brushed past her, carrying with it the scent of lilacs and rain. A door opened. No one stepped out, but on the bench beside her, where no one had been sitting a moment ago, there now lay an envelope. It was sealed in wax, marked with the same ribbon she had tied around her own. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. The handwriting on the front was familiar, her own, but the ink looked fresh. The letter read simply, "Thank you for waiting." Clara smiled, tears glinting in her eyes, though she didn't fully understand why. She pressed the envelope to her chest and leaned back, listening as the train began to move again, slowly gliding into the fog until its lights faded like candles in the rain. The station returned to stillness. Only the rain remained, and the steady ticking of the clock. The next morning, sunlight drifted gently through Clara's lace curtains, spilling over the wooden floor in thin, trembling ribbons. The air smelled faintly of rain, that clean, sweet scent that lingers after a long storm, when the world feels like it has been washed new. Clara woke slowly, her mind hazy, her heart still full of the quiet warmth she had felt the night before. The memory of the train, the glowing light, the letter with her own handwriting, it all hovered on the edge of her thoughts, like a dream too delicate to touch. She rose, brushed her fingers across the old clock by her bedside, and smiled faintly when it chimed softly, the same rhythm as the one in the station. Outside, the streets of Maple Cross were still. A few early risers swept their porches, and the bakery at the corner had just begun to open, its windows fogging with the warmth of fresh bread. Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way toward town, her steps unhurried, her breath mingling with the cool morning air. She passed the bookstore, a small place filled with secondhand novels and the scent of ink and paper, and paused at the window. There, sitting in the display, was an old photograph. It showed the Maple Cross station in its prime, bustling crowds, porters carrying luggage, a young man in a dark suit standing by the tracks with a letter in his hand. Her heart gave a small tremor. She leaned closer to the glass. The photograph was faintly water damaged, but the man's face was clear enough. Kind eyes, a gentle smile, and something familiar about the way he stood, as though waiting for someone. The shopkeeper, Mr. Harlan, came to unlock the door, giving Clara a polite nod. "Morning, Miss Clara," he said with his usual warmth. "Morning, Harold," she replied. "That photograph in your window, it's new?" He turned and looked at it, his brow furrowing slightly. "Funny thing that. I found it in a box of old railway documents that got donated last week. I was going to frame it properly, but something about it felt nostalgic, I suppose." "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. "Do you know who he is?" Harold shook his head. "No name written on the back. Just the date, 1946. The year they shut the line down, I think." Clara nodded, her gaze lingering on the man's face. She could almost imagine him stepping out of that photograph, brushing the dust from his coat, and smiling at her the way one does when they recognize an old friend after many years. Later that day, she found herself back at the station. The air was different now, bright and warm, filled with the hum of bees drifting through the overgrown wildflowers that had taken root along the tracks. She walked slowly, her shoes brushing through the long grass, and stood before the platform. It was strange. Even in daylight, the place felt alive. The benches gleamed faintly, as though polished by unseen hands. The lantern that had burned the night before was dark now, but Clara could still sense a quiet energy in the air, something that hummed softly beneath the sound of birdsong. She stepped inside. The smell of wood, oil, and thyme greeted her, familiar and comforting. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight, streaming through the cracked windows. Everything looked the same, and yet not quite. On the floor, near the ticket counter, lay a folded piece of parchment. She bent down and picked it up carefully. It wasn't one of her letters. It was older, yellowed with age, tied with twine. The handwriting on the front was elegant, almost formal, to whoever still waits. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, the words were faded but legible. If you are reading this, then perhaps time has not forgotten you. I once waited here too, for someone who never returned. Each night, I left a letter, and each morning it was gone. I never learned who took them. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps it was her. But I began to hear things in the quiet. The sound of footsteps on the tracks, the whisper of her laughter in the walls. I think this place remembers those who love deeply enough to wait. If you're still waiting, you're not alone. Clara's eyes stung. She held the paper close, as though its warmth could seep into her hands. The words felt as though they had been written for her, or perhaps by her in another lifetime. She sat down on the bench where she had sat the night before and looked at the drawer-marked letters for the journey. It was closed now, but a faint golden line glimmered along the edge, just enough to catch her eye. As she watched, the drawer opened a fraction, a breath of air escaping like a sigh. Inside, something shimmered. Not paper this time, but light, like a reflection caught in water. She leaned closer and saw that it wasn't just light at all, but an image. The same platform, the same bench, but from another time. Travelers, laughter, steam, and the sound of a whistle. And among them, the man from the photograph. He stood by the tracks, glancing toward the bench where Clara sat now, though of course he couldn't see her. He reached into his pocket, drew out a letter, and placed it gently into the drawer before walking toward the open doors of the train. Then he hesitated, turned slightly, looked right at her. Clara gasped softly, her heart catching. His gaze was calm, kind, almost knowing, and then the light faded. The drawer closed. The vision vanished. For a long while, she sat in silence. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock, the soft hum of wind through the window frame. When she finally stood, she knew she would return that night. Evening came slowly, as though the sun was reluctant to leave. The clouds turned peach and lavender, the river beyond the tracks glinting like melted gold. Clara arrived at the station just as the first stars began to appear. She carried with her another letter, this one written not in farewell, but in gratitude. She sat on the same bench and read the words quietly before sealing the envelope. I don't know who you are or if you're real, but if you waited once, I want you to know someone is waiting still, and she remembers you. She placed the letter in the drawer. The wood was warm beneath her fingertips. The lantern flickered to life beside her, though she hadn't lit it. The air grew softer. The light turned golden. And then she heard it again, the sound of a distant train rolling through the fog. This time, she did not hesitate. She stood and stepped toward the edge of the platform. The train emerged, slow and silent, gleaming under the moonlight. The door opened. Inside, there was no conductor, no passengers. Just a row of empty seats bathed in soft amber glow. And at the far end, a single letter waiting on the cushion. Clara picked it up. The handwriting was his. I kept the time. You kept the heart. Come home. Her eyes closed. And for the first time in years, she felt no weight, no waiting, only peace. She stepped aboard, and the door closed gently behind her. The train began to move, slowly, silently, fading into the mist. By morning, the station was empty again, but something had changed. The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at midnight. Yet somehow, the lantern still burned, steady and warm. And in the drawer marked letters for the journey, there lay a new envelope. No name on the front, just a single sentence. Sometimes, the heart keeps time long after the clock has stopped. The rain began to fall again, soft, rhythmic, tender. The sound of it filled the old station like a lullaby. And if you happened to pass by Maple Cross that night, You might see the faint outline of a train on the horizon, gliding silently through the fog, carrying those who still believe in the letters left behind, in the time that never truly ends. Days drifted by like leaves on a quiet stream. Clara returned to the station each evening, carrying her journal, her thermos of chamomile tea, and a lantern that once belonged to her father. The place had become her sanctuary, a space between worlds, where time seemed to loosen its grip, and everything she had ever lost came back to her in whispers. The people of Maple Cross began to notice her routine. Mrs. Alden from the bakery often packed her an extra pastry, smiling knowingly as she handed it over. For the train, she'd say, her eyes soft with the kind of understanding that didn't require words. Even Harold from the bookstore began leaving books by the window, old ones about journeys, letters, and love that waited patiently through the years. Sometimes Clara would read aloud in the station. Her voice would drift through the stillness, wrapping around the empty benches and echoing faintly against the walls. It always felt like someone was listening, perhaps the man from the photograph, or the soul who had once written to whoever still waits. The nights grew cooler. The scent of wood smoke hung in the air, and the sound of crickets blended with the distant rush of the river. Every now and then, she would hear the faint hum of the train, not loud, but steady, like the heartbeat of the past still pulsing beneath the town. One evening, she brought a small envelope filled with dried lavender and placed it in the drawer. Inside was a note that simply read, "To the one who loved this place before me, thank you for keeping alive." When she returned the next morning, the lavender was gone. In its place was a silver button, simple, old-fashioned, engraved with a small train wheel. She held it in her palm, the metal cool against her skin, and smiled. It was a token, a thank you perhaps, or a promise that she was not alone in her remembering. That night, she dreamed of the station as it had once been. She saw herself standing on the platform, but not as she was now. Her hair was darker, her dress long and pale, and she was holding a letter sealed in wax. Across the tracks, the man from the photograph waited. The air shimmered with light, soft as breath, and she heard his voice, faint, tender. "You found me, Clara. You always do." She woke with tears in her eyes, the dream still clinging to her heart like a melody that refuses to fade. The morning sun spilled across her floorboards, touching the corner of her journal. When she opened it, she found a line written in unfamiliar handwriting. "Time bends for love that listens." She didn't remember writing it, and yet she knew it belonged there. As autumn deepened, the station began to change. Vines crept up the brick walls, their leaves turning crimson and gold. The air grew crisp, and the sound of the river carried more clearly through the night. One evening, when a mist rolled thick over the fields, Clara noticed something new. A faint light in the distance, down the old railway path where the tracks disappeared into the woods. Curiosity stirred in her like a forgotten song. She lit her lantern and followed the glimmering path. The mist curled around her ankles, and the faint hum of rails beneath her feet felt alive, as though the metal remembered every journey it had ever carried. After what felt like both minutes and hours, she reached a clearing. There, standing quietly in the fog, was a second platform, smaller, half buried in wildflowers and ivy. A single train car rested there, its paint faded, its windows glowing softly with golden light. She climbed a small step and peered inside. Rows of empty seats stretched before her, each one holding an envelope on a cushion. She picked one up carefully. The handwriting was the same as before, neat, graceful, timeless. For the ones who still write, for the hearts that still wait. Every letter left behind finds its reader eventually. She walked slowly through the car, reading the words on the envelopes, some addressed to the dreamers, some to the lost, some to the one who stayed. Every letter seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that matched the rhythm of her own heartbeat. When she reached the far end, she found one seat empty, no envelope this time. Instead, there was a small wooden box. Inside, a fountain pen, old and elegant, its nib still glistening with fresh ink. Beneath it, a note. "It's your turn now." Clara smiled through the tears that gathered quietly at the corners of her eyes. She understood. She took the pen, walked back to the station, and placed a clean sheet of paper in the drawer marked "Letters for the Journey." For the first time, she didn't write to the past. She wrote to whoever would come next. "Dear traveler, if you have found this place, then you, too, have heard the echo of something old and kind. The station remembers all who listen. Sit for a while. The train may come, or it may not. But either way, you are already on your way." She folded the letter, tied it with twine, and placed it in the drawer. That night, the lanterns burned brighter than ever. The station glowed from within, as though it were alive with every story ever told, every goodbye that had turned into a new beginning. When Clara left, she looked back only once, and in that moment she saw him again. The man from the photograph, standing at the far end of the platform, hat in hand, smiling that same gentle, eternal smile. She raised her lantern in greeting. He nodded, then faded into the mist. The train whistle sounded softly, not behind her this time, but within her. And as she walked home, the world felt lighter. The air smelled of paper and rain, of old stories finding their endings. The town clock chimed midnight, and she knew, somehow, that the station's light would never go out again. Years passed. Children grew, streets changed, but the Maple Cross station remained. Some said it was haunted, but not by sadness, by memory, by kindness, by love that had outlasted time itself. On quiet evenings, travelers passing through the valley sometimes swore they saw a faint light by the tracks, and if they listened closely, they could hear the sound of a pen scratching softly on paper. And every so often, when the mist was just right, a letter would appear at someone's doorstep. Words of comfort written in delicate ink, signed only with a simple line. From a station that still remembers. The letters never asked for reply. They only arrived when someone needed them most. And somewhere, deep in the heart of Maple Cross, beneath the sound of falling rain and the hum of forgotten rails, the old clock kept its gentle rhythm, one that only those who truly listened could hear. Winter crept into Maple Cross the way a sigh escapes tired lips, quietly, without a rush. The trees along the old railway stood bare, their branches trembling against the pale sky. Frost glazed the platform each morning, and when the first light touched the station windows, it looked as though the world itself was made of glass. Clara now visited not just in the evenings, but also at dawn. Something about the early hour, when the mist still hugged the earth and the air tasted faintly of wood smoke, made the station feel like the threshold of another world. The tracks stretched ahead, vanishing into fog, a road to everywhere and nowhere all at once. She brought with her a blanket now, a small cushion, a flask of coffee. Sometimes she would sit and simply breathe. The sound of her breath mingled with the distant hum of invisible trains and the soft groan of the old beams above her. Every now and then, she would whisper hello to the quiet, and sometimes the quiet whispered back. On one such morning, as she brushed a layer of frost from the wooden bench, she noticed a faint shimmer under the seat. Curious, she knelt and found another envelope, tucked carefully into the shadows. It was older than the others, its paper yellowed, its edges worn soft. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, elegant and curved, the same hand that had written to the one who still waits. She opened it with trembling fingers. If you're reading this, you have already heard the train. Some wait for it all their lives. Others never know they were waiting at all. When the whistle sounds, do not be afraid. The journey is gentler than you think. Time, after all, is just another way of remembering. The signature was smudged, unreadable. Clara read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and held it to her chest. A warmth bloomed beneath her ribs, quiet but steady, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of being seen. Days passed. Snow began to fall, soft and patient, covering the platform in white. The river near the station froze at the edges, and icicles hung like glass bells from the eaves. The whole world seemed to move slower, quieter, as if taking a long, deep breath. And in that stillness, Clara began to write more letters. Some she left in the drawer, others beneath the bench, and a few she tied with ribbon and placed on a windowsill. She didn't know who would find them or when, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was the act itself, the ink, the words, the quiet promise of connection across time. One evening, when the snow fell heavy and the world was hushed beneath its weight, she heard it again, that faint, familiar whistle. Not loud, not close, but clear enough to make her heart pause. The lanterns flickered as if stirred by unseen movement. She rose, walked to the door, and opened it. Outside, the night glowed faintly blue under the snowfall. And there, far down the tracks, she saw the outline of train. It shimmered, not quite solid, not quite light, but something in between. Its windows glowed gold, and shadows moved within. Passengers, perhaps, or memories dressed as people. The air was thick with the scent of rain and metal. The snow melted where the wheels should have touched, though there was no sound, no vibration, just the hum of the world holding its breath. Clara stepped closer, her boots crunching softly on the snow. The train slowed to a stop, and one door slid open with a whisper. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then a voice drifted from within, soft, steady, achingly familiar. "You've been waiting a long time, Clara." She froze. That voice, it was impossible, and yet she knew it. Her father had been gone for years, and yet the timbre of it, that gentle calm, that patient kindness, felt exactly like his. "Come in," the voice said. "Just for a while. The train always knows when it's time." Clara's lantern flickered. She took a breath and stepped forward, one hand reaching for the doorframe. The air inside was warmer, scented faintly of cedar and lavender. Rows of empty seats stretched before her, each one glowing softly from within. And at the far end, beneath a single lamp, sat a man in a conductor's uniform. He smiled when he saw her. His face was lined with years, but his eyes held the kind of peace that no time could erode. "I knew you'd find it," he said. "You always did have the heart of a listener." She couldn't speak, her throat tight, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "This isn't the end," he continued gently. "It's only a pause. The world goes on, even when the tracks run quiet. But every once in a while, someone like you stops to listen. And when they do, the train remembers." He gestured to the seat beside him. "Would you like to hear the stories?" Clara nodded. He opened a small journal and began to read. The words were simple, beautiful, letters written long ago by people who had once sat on this very train. Some were messages of love, others of farewell, and a few were simply thank yous to strangers who had smiled at them across a crowded car. The rhythm of his voice lulled her, steady as a heartbeat, soft as snowfall. She felt her eyes grow heavy, her breathing slow. Time seemed to fold in on itself, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was awake or dreaming. When she opened her eyes again, she was alone. The train was gone. The tracks were silent. Only her lantern remained, burning bright beside her. And in her lap, resting gently, was the old conductor's journal, its final page blank except for one line, written in her own handwriting. "The letters will always find their way home." Clara closed the book, pressing her hand over her heart. The snow had stopped. The stars above were clear, sharp, endless. She turned toward the station, where the light still glowed from within, and walked back through the hush of night. Behind her, the air shimmered faintly, like a sigh too soft to hear, and if one had been listening closely, one might have caught the echo of a whistle, fading slowly into the horizon. Weeks later, a traveler stopped by the Maple Cross station on a winter night. The fire in the small stove had gone out, but the room was warm anyway, a kind of warmth that didn't come from heat but from memory. He noticed the drawer labeled letters for the journey and opened it. Inside were dozens of envelopes, neatly tied with ribbons of different colors. One sat on top, addressed in careful handwriting, to whoever still believes in arrival. He smiled, tucked it into his coat, and left without a sound. Outside, the moonlight fell across the tracks, and for just a moment, it looked as if they were glowing, faint like a promise. Days turned quietly into weeks, and the snow deepened around Maple Cross, blanketing the hills in a hush so complete that even the birds forgot to sing. The old station slept beneath its white crown, and though no trains had come through for decades, the air around it still felt expectant, as if every snowflake that touched the roof paused to listen for something. Clara, too, seemed to become part of the landscape. Each day, she came with her lantern and thermos, her notebook tucked under one arm. Her steps left the same winding trail through the snow, always leading to the same bench on the platform. The cold never seemed to bother her anymore. She had grown accustomed to the way the world held its breath around her. At first, she thought she came for the letters. Then she realized she came for something else, something wordless. The peace that hung between moments. The way the wind whispered through the rafters, as if it remembered names she had forgotten. She would sit for hours, watching the mist curl over the tracks, her pen moving almost on its own. Sometimes the letters she wrote were addressed to no one. Sometimes they were apologies. Sometimes they were thank yous to people she had never met. And though she never heard another whistle, there were small signs, subtle, kind. Once she found a single ticket on the ground, its edges burned, its print long faded. Another time, she returned to find the stove inside the waiting room softly warm, though she hadn't lit it in days. The world was gently reminding her that she was not alone. One evening, near midwinter, Clara arrived later than usual. A heavy fog had rolled in, turning the station into a dream of shadows and lantern light. She lit her lamp and walked slowly to the bench, her breath hanging silver in the cold air. The silence was deep, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that waits. She sat and placed the journal in her lap. The last page still bore her own words. The letters will always find their way home. She thought of the conductor, of his gentle eyes and the steady rhythm of his voice, and wondered where the train had gone, or if it had ever been there at all. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe dreams were simply doors to places too soft for waking. She smiled faintly at the thought, and for a while, she simply sat. The air was cold enough to sting, yet she felt an odd warmth behind her ribs, as though a small light lived there, burning steadily. Then, out of the fog, she heard footsteps. Slow, careful, real. A shape emerged. A man, wrapped in a thick coat, his shoulders dusted with snow. He looked uncertain, as though unsure if he was trespassing in someone else's dream. "Hello," Clara said softly. He paused, startled by the voice, then nodded. "Evening. Didn't think anyone would be here." "Most people don't," she said, smiling. "The station likes its quiet." He chuckled, a sound that echoed faintly through the fog. "I used to come here as a boy. My mother worked the telegraph inside. Haven't been back since she passed." Clara gestured to the bench beside her. "You can sit if you'd like. The cold isn't as cruel when you share it." He hesitated, then sat. For a while, neither spoke. They just watched the snow drift through the beams of the lantern. After a long silence, he noticed the letters on her lap. "Are those yours?" "Some," she said. "Most belong to others." "Others?" She smiled. "People who came before. People still on their way. I just keep them company." He nodded slowly, though he didn't seem to understand. Then his gaze softened, and he whispered, "My mother used to write letters too. She said they kept the world from forgetting." That sounded like something the station would agree with. He looked around, his eyes tracing the old beams, the cracks in the wood, the frost-shimmered windows. "Feels like time stopped here," he said. "Sometimes it does," she answered. "Sometimes it's waiting for someone to listen again." They sat in silence for a while longer. The man pulled a small object from his pocket, an old brass key on a chain. "She said this opened a drawer in the station," he murmured, "but I never found which one." Clara's eyes brightened. "I think I know where it belongs." She led him inside the waiting room, her lantern casting long shadows across the walls. The old drawers behind the counter still stood in neat rows, labeled in faded ink. Tickets, receipts, letters for the journey. She pointed to the last one. The man knelt, inserted the key, and turned. With a soft click, the drawer opened. Inside were dozens of letters tied with blue ribbons, and on top a small wooden box. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a single envelope, sealed in wax. The name on it made his breath hitch. To my son, if he ever returns. He stood motionless for a long time. Then he opened it. If you are reading this, then I have gone ahead, but I am not far. This place will keep my memory, and it will keep yours too. Leave a letter when you go. Someone will find it, and the chain will never break. Tears filled his eyes, silent and sudden. He looked at Clara, who only nodded, her own gaze glimmering with understanding. She was waiting for you, Clara whispered, and now she can rest. He smiled through the tears, closed the letter, and placed it back inside the drawer, leaving a new one in its place. When he left, the fog had thinned, and dawn was just touching the horizon. Clara stood at the door and watched him disappear down the path, his lantern swinging softly in the cold light. Then she turned back to the station. The world inside seemed to breathe again. The floorboards creaked gently. The air shimmered faintly warm, and the faintest hum, like the memory of an engine, lingered in the walls. She sat once more on the bench, feeling the heartbeat of the place beneath her. She realized now that the station wasn't haunted, not by ghosts at least. It was haunted by love, by all the people who had once said goodbye here or waited for someone who never came, by every promise whispered under the sound of a departing train, by every letter that was written but never sent. And somehow, she was part of that story now. She looked up, and for the first time in years, she saw a faint golden light flicker along the horizon, the same direction the train had once come from. The air shimmered. The whistle sounded. Soft, far, beautiful. Clara smiled, leaned back against the bench, and let her eyes close. The world slowed. The snow fell. The lantern dimmed, and as the whistle faded into silence, the station held its breath once more, peaceful, timeless, waiting for whoever would come next. Spring came quietly to Maple Cross. It arrived not with fanfare, but with a sigh, the kind that only those who had endured long winters could truly hear. Snow melted from the roof of the station in slow, silver streams, dripping onto the tracks like a soft rhythm. The river nearby swelled with life again, carrying bits of driftwood, twigs, and the smell of earth newly awakened. Clara still came every day. She swept the platform clear of old leaves, dusted the benches, and polished the brass lamp in the waiting room until it caught the light just right. The station had become a part of her, or perhaps she had become part of it. Sometimes, as she worked, she'd hum to herself, old tunes her grandmother had once sung. Other times, she'd simply sit, watching how sunlight filtered through the tall windows, making tiny dust motes dance in the golden air. She had grown older since that first letter, not in the way people usually meant, not just in years, but in stillness. Her eyes carried a calm weight, a knowing that came only from those who had learned to wait without wanting. Visitors came now and then, wanderers, lost travelers, people looking for something they couldn't quite name. They would find Clara, and she would smile, offer them tea, and ask, "Have you ever written a letter you never sent?" Sometimes they'd laugh and shake their heads. Sometimes they'd grow quiet and nod. And each time, she would place a blank envelope in their hands and say, "Then perhaps now is the time." The visitors never questioned why. They just wrote. Some cried as they did. Some smiled through tears. Some left the letters in drawers. Others burned them in the old stove. But no matter what they did, they always left lighter, as though something inside them had finally let go. And every time one of them departed, the wind would sigh softly through the rafters, almost like a voice whispering thanks. One evening, near dusk, Clara stood outside the station, watching the horizon fade into violet. A storm was gathering beyond the hills, soft rumbling, not yet angry, but powerful enough to make the earth tremble. She went inside, lit the lamp, and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The warm light spilled across the worn wooden floor, touching the edges of every drawer, every forgotten ticket stub, every folded page tucked between books on the shelf. The room seemed alive, like the station was breathing again. She sat down at her desk and opened her journal, its pages filled with years of letters. The one she wrote that night was simple. Time doesn't stop here. It simply learns to rest. Every goodbye becomes a kind of homecoming if you wait long enough. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the sky, like distant drums echoing from another world. The storm broke not in anger, but in grace. Rain swept over the platform, tapping the windows, filling the silence with a soothing rhythm. The sound reminded Clara of her father's workshop, of evenings spent listening to the rain while he told her stories about travelers and trains that never lost their way. She closed her eyes, smiling at the memory. When she opened them again, something caught her attention. Through the fog glass of the ticket window, a faint glow shimmered on the tracks, pale, golden, almost unreal. Her breath caught. It was the light again, the same gentle gleam she had seen all those years ago when the phantom train first passed. Slowly, she rose, took her lantern, and stepped outside. The rain had eased into a mist, and the world felt impossibly still, the kind of stillness that feels sacred, like the pause between heartbeats. There, just beyond the curve of the platform, the rails gleamed brighter than they should have, stretching into the distance like threads of moonlight. And standing on the far end of the platform, bathed in that golden glow, was a familiar figure, tall, kind eyes, a conductor's hat resting neatly on his head. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from fear, but from recognition. He smiled, the same way he had before. "You've kept it well," he said softly. "I tried," she whispered. He nodded. "You did more than that. You kept alive." The lantern in her hand flickered, and she looked around. The air was shimmering faintly, the way heat rises off the summer road, and through it she could see shapes. Faces, travelers in coats and hats, stepping onto invisible platforms, holding letters close to their chests. Their expressions were peaceful, grateful. Clara realized then that these were all the souls whose letters she had found, or who had left theirs here in her care. The conductor stepped closer. "It's time, Clara." She hesitated, glancing at the station behind her, its soft, golden light, the scent of old paper, the sound of rain against glass. "Will it stay?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Always. Someone will find it when it's time. Someone who needs to listen." She smiled through the tears. "Then I'm ready." She placed her lantern on the bench beside her. It glowed for a moment longer, then dimmed gently, its light joining the soft shimmer that hung around the platform. The conductor offered his hand, and she took it. Together, they stepped forward, and as they did, the sound of a train filled the air, distant at first, then growing, not loud but rich, like a memory returning. The whistle rose, long, slow, beautiful. The golden light brightened, and then, with a breath, it was gone. When the dawn came, the world was quiet again. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. The old station stood still, its roof glistening in the sunlight. The door was slightly open, and inside, the lantern on the bench burned faintly, its last ember glowing like a heartbeat. And on the counter lay a single letter. Its envelope was sealed with a pressed violet, and the words written in careful hand. "To whoever finds this place is not lost. It's waiting. Listen, and you'll hear what time forgot." Clara, years passed. The tracks rusted further. The trees grew taller, and eventually, the town of Maple Cross faded from maps. But travelers still found their way to the old station. Hikers, dreamers, people who couldn't sleep. They would stumble upon it by chance, step through its door, and feel something they couldn't name, a warmth, a hush, a heartbeat. And often, they would find a drawer half open, a blank envelope waiting, and a faint scent of violets in the air. Those who stayed long enough swore they could hear it too. The sound of a distant train moving through fog, bound for somewhere beyond time. And sometimes, when the light was just right, they thought they saw her, a woman in a shawl, sitting by the window, smiling softly, listening as the world rested. Years drifted by, and the old train station stood quietly at the edge of Maple Cross. The tracks rusted further, and weeds crept up between the ties. But the air still held something sacred, a whisper that time had forgotten, a stillness that hummed softly beneath the sound of the wind. No one could quite explain why travelers still found their way there. The place wasn't on any map. The road leading to it was half overgrown, the signs long faded, the wooden fence leaning in weary surrender to the years. But somehow people arrived, drawn by something they couldn't name. One misty morning, a young woman named Evelyn appeared at the edge of the path. She wasn't from Maple Cross. In fact, she hadn't planned to stop there at all. She was driving from the city, worn thin from long months of sleepless nights, when her car sputtered to a stop near the edge of the woods. She stepped out, rubbing her eyes, and saw it through the fog. A faint light, golden and flickering, as if someone were holding a lantern deep within the trees. It shouldn't have been possible. She was miles from anywhere, and yet something about it felt right. She followed the light. Her shoes brushed through fallen leaves, and the air smelled faintly of rain and lilacs, though it was too early in the season for flowers. The sound of her steps softened until all she could hear was the rhythmic hum of her own breathing and the distant song of birds just waking. When she reached the clearing, she stopped. The station stood there exactly as Clara had left it, though Evelyn didn't know her name yet. The building leaned slightly to one side, its paint faded to soft amber, its windows glowing faintly from within. The sign above the door read Maple Cross Station, the letters nearly erased by time. For a moment, Evelyn thought she must be dreaming. She pushed the door open. It creaked, but the sound wasn't unpleasant. It was welcoming, like the sigh of a home relieved to be found again. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old paper and lavender. Dust danced through the sunlight, streaming in from high windows. A brass clock on the wall ticked quietly, its hands moving slower than normal, as though time here had chosen a gentler pace. She wandered through the room, running her fingers along the counter, the wooden benches, the shelves lined with faded books and half-burned candles. Then she saw the letters, dozens of them, stacked neatly in drawers, tied with bits of twine, labeled with dates that stretched back decades. She picked one up. The paper was delicate, the handwriting neat and careful. Dear whoever listens, I missed the last train. Maybe that was meant to happen. Maybe we all have to miss something to truly arrive somewhere else. She smiled softly, reading the words again. Then she reached for another. I waited for someone here once. I don't remember his face anymore, but I remember the sound of the clock and the rain. That feels like enough. Each letter carried the same tender ache, small confessions left by people who had loved, lost, and learned to rest. She read for hours, losing all sense of time. The clock ticked softly. The light shifted from morning to dusk without her noticing. It wasn't until she looked up and saw the shadows lengthening that she realized. The lamp on the counter had lit itself. It glowed faintly, like a small heart still beating. Evelyn stood, the letter still in her hand, and whispered, "Who are you?" The air seemed to respond. A faint shimmer of warmth brushed against her skin, and somewhere in the quiet, she thought she heard a woman's voice, gentle and far away. Someone who waited and someone who listened. Evelyn turned slowly toward the window. For a moment, she thought she saw her, a woman with soft gray hair, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, sitting by the glass, her reflection faintly smiling. But when Evelyn blinked, the image was gone. That night, she stayed in the station. She lit the lanterns, swept the floor, made tea from the leaves she carried in her bag. As the fire in the stove warmed the small room, she wrote a letter of her own. For the one who kept this place, I don't know why I found you. Maybe I didn't find you at all. Maybe you found me. I've been so tired of rushing through days, so afraid of stillness. But tonight, it feels like the world has finally slowed down enough for me to breathe. Thank you for that. She folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others. Outside, the rain began again, soft and rhythmic, pattering gently against the roof. The sound was soothing, like fingers tracing over the surface of sleep. Evelyn leaned back, eyes heavy, and listened. Somewhere beyond the storm, faintly, came the sound of a train whistle, long, low, and hauntingly beautiful. She smiled, letting the sound carry her into dreams. When she woke, dawn was spilling through the windows. The air was golden, the rain had stopped, and the world outside shimmered with dew. She stood and looked around. The station seemed brighter now, the dust had settled, and everything gleamed softly, as if newly alive. She opened one of the drawers to place her letter again, but something stopped her. There, resting on the counter, was a new envelope. Her name written across it in neat, elegant script. Her breath caught. She tore it open gently. Evelyn, you found what was never lost. The station remembers kindness, and it keeps the stories of those who listen. You've brought its heart back to life. Time will take care of the rest. See, she pressed the letter to her chest and smiled. She didn't know who C was, but she could feel her presence, warm and patient, lingering in the corners of the old station. Evelyn stayed for 3 more days. She cleaned the lamps, oiled the hinges, repaired the leaky roof, and planted flowers along the edge of the platform. When she finally left, she placed a small brass key under the mat by the door, just in case someone else ever needed to find it again. As she walked away, the air shimmered faintly, and the sound of a train echoed once more through the trees. Not a real train, but the kind that only existed in dreams. Years later, travelers who stumbled upon the place spoke of a young woman who ran a small reading haven by the forest, a quiet spot where people could leave letters, rest for a while, and listen to the sound of the rain. They said she never asked for money. She only smiled and said, "Write what you need to let go of." And sometimes, on still nights, they swore they could hear the faint hum of wheels gliding on invisible tracks, the whisper of a conductor's voice, and a woman's laughter, soft, warm, eternal, blending with the wind that passed through the station doors.